Well, thank you very much to the Foundation and to my publisher, Crítica, for making this event possible this evening. It's an extraordinary pleasure for me to be in Madrid and in Spain and talking to an audience here. It's a matter, I think, of great personal satisfaction for me that this book has appeared in Spanish so quickly, because Spain is clearly at the forefront of the issue of the Eurozone crisis and what spiraled out of the global financial crisis of 2008. And I look forward to exploring some aspects of that in Q&A later. I'm not a specialist, I should say, in Spanish economic history, but the topic is so salient to the more general history of the crisis that we can't avoid it, and I hope we won't in subsequent discussion. I apologize also for not being able to speak to you in Spanish. French and German I can cope with, but for somebody living in the United States, as long as I have it, is a true deficit not to have acquired at least functional fluency in your language, so that's a heartfelt apology. The subject I'm talking about this evening is the question really of the shock of 2008. And I think it's very important just to appreciate how severe, how dramatic, how cataclysmic this shock appeared to be. I'm asked again and again by interviewers, by journalists, well, is it going to happen again? When is the next one going to arrive? And the important thing, I think, to realize is how contemporaries, well-informed, sober, cool-headed contemporaries, people such as Ben Bernanke, sized up the crisis in the autumn of 2008. Bernanke was not exaggerating when he said to Congress, or barely exaggerating, when he said to Congress in the days after the collapse of Lehman, that if we don't do this, by which he meant support for Wall Street's banks, we may not have an economy on Monday. In the judgment of one of the foremost economic historians of the Great Depression in the 1930s, what we were witnessing in September and October 2008 was quite simply the worst financial crisis the world had ever seen. It's very important to realize the significance of this. We're not talking about one of the regular bouts of the flu that the global economy is subject to in the course of the regular business cycle. We're not talking about the kind of sclerosis that might overcome the global economy as a result of a retreat towards protectionism. We're talking about here the risk of an acute, massive, and fatal heart attack to a stroke within the global financial system. What this looked like in macroeconomic terms is summarized by this truly astonishing chart. These are the flows of money across borders, both in and outflows summed across borders. And you see the scale of the collapse between 07 and 08. This is what a global economy looks like when it is beginning to flatline, as in an emergency medical scenario. The heart goes dead. That's what you're seeing here in global capital flows. For the first time in history, we saw the possibility not just of the collapse of one national banking system, and the American banking system is what we're talking about in the first instance, with a series of huge bank failures sweeping across the United States, but the very distinct possibility of the collapse of the entire banking system on the other side of the Atlantic at the same time. This is what Bernanke was referring to when he described 2008 as more dangerous, more terrifying, even than what happened after 1929. After 1929, there were bank failures bit by bit, year by year, building up to, with a crescendo to the drama of 1933 in the United States, but nothing like this risk to the entire banking system of the transatlantic economy. And the effects of this on the real economy were not long in waiting. This doesn't remain a mere issue of Wall Street or global banking for very long. This is the chart of the American labor market, counting the losses of jobs month by month during the crisis period over the most severe, most disastrous months of 2008 to 9. 800,000 American jobs are being lost every single month. This is an appalling hemorrhage of jobs. In terms of the fall of global production and global trade, of industrial production, in the first 12 months of the crisis, 2008 is every bit as bad as anything that we saw in 1929. This is what it looks like in the Eurozone. Again, putting in context the later experience of the Eurozone economies, which you can see towards the right-hand side of this chart, As you can see here, if we're looking at the collapse in credit within the Eurozone, the big hit, the first initial collapse, is over the spring, summer, autumn, and then into 2008, which is the moment where we see the sudden and massive deceleration of the Eurozone. As bad as things were going to get later, the initial shock is in that first 12-month period. This is the chart of Spanish unemployment, and it shows the same basic picture. Much as we remember the agony of Spanish society and Spanish economy and center it crucially on the phase of the Eurozone crisis after 2010, as you can see here, more than half of the surge in unemployment that will transform the face of Spanish politics and Spanish society and brings to a shocking end the boom of the early phase of the Eurozone. Most of that happens in the immediate aftermath of 2008, as the Spanish housing market slows down dramatically and the Spanish banking system shifts into crisis, not after the fall of 2009 when the Greeks make their announcement and the Eurozone starts. So this is a shock to the entire transatlantic economy, astonishingly synchronized through the simultaneous slowing down of real estate booms on both sides of the Atlantic and crises in the banking sector. And what my book attempts to do is to spell out the economic logic of this crisis, to uncover the new processes through which it propagated, to reveal also some aspects of the way in which economists have come to understand the crisis, and to spell out the political and geopolitical ramifications of these events, placing the crisis in the context of transatlantic relations and geopolitics in the wake of the Cold War. And there's a story, of course, that's very familiar, which I'm going to trace briefly with a series of images of what it is the crisis of 2008 is taken to be. All of these images deliberately chosen from the American side. First and foremost, it's a crisis of the Wall Street banks, symbolized by the failure of Lehman on the 15th of September 2008. It followed the near collapse of Bear Stearns earlier that year. And that's a story which we've come to think of as being integrally related to the sophistication and complexity of financial engineering. I always think of this graph as being eerily akin to the maps that we draw of nuclear reactors. It's that kind of a technology, a technological system that we don't really understand, that is running out of control, that the wizards of Wall Street have created but don't really control, and is now going to blow the global economy up. This is a simplified diagram, in fact, of the process of pooling, slicing, and tranching debt that was the process of securitization. That, of course, was fed by primal urges. The deathless diatribe launched against Goldman Sachs by Matt Taibbi will remain forever a piece of the American political lexicon. He described Goldman Sachs as the great vampire squid on the face of humanity. So another version of the story of 2008 is that of rampant greed, of an out-of-control banking community that is sapping the lifeblood of global society. All of these, of course, each vision of the banking crisis comes with its own politics and its own rhetoric. Behind that stands the story of an American society fundamentally out of touch with its limited means, being fed an endless diet of the propaganda of credit and consumption. This surely one of the most irresponsible marketing campaigns ever launched by a bank. Open a cravings account, satisfy your desires by taking out credit, live richly. Don't actually become rich, but live as though you were, a courtesy of a credit facility by Citigroup. And behind that, of course, stands the real story of the enrollment of a large part, not just of American, but of European society, in the fantasy of prosperity by means of real estate speculation. The idea that you can rise out of a regular life by means of speculating in housing and real estate. And as much as the story that I'm going to be telling here is a story of elite decision-making, it's clear that at the bottom rungs of this process An entire industry of popular culture was mobilized before 2008 in pursuit of this vision of prosperity through individual entrepreneurship, by flipping houses, through real estate speculation. Through every channel in the media, you were encouraged to pursue this means of self-enrichment. And it has real effects. If you look at the mortgages issued in the United States in the run-up to the crisis in 2008, these are nationwide figures, and you can see that as much as a third of the mortgages issued in the true boom period in 2005 and 6 are second, third, and fourth mortgages. This is, in other words, petty speculation by families trying to build small real estate empires. If you look in the boom states, California, okay, well, I've got something on my screen down here which is asking me to accept something. I hope that's not showing there. In California, in Florida, and so on, 45% of mortgages are being issued as part of speculative small-scale activity. So a big part of the boom in the United States is being driven from the bottom up. It takes two to tango. Much of this, of course, is irresponsible advertising by the banks, but one cannot underestimate this call to wealth, the mobilization that took place around it. On the other side of the Atlantic, if there was one thing that European politicians agreed on in 2008, it was that this was not their problem. This entire drama was an American drama. It was an American sickness. It was the result of that chain that I've just sketched for you with those polemical images. It's a chain of an unhinged society not capable of living within its own boundaries. I'm very sorry to interrupt here, but the monitor at the front has gone out, so I can't any longer see the slides I'm using. I'm going to go on anyway, because I don't want to interrupt things. But I have a black screen at the front here. We'll keep on going. I'm sure it'll be okay. But you'll forgive me if I kind of maneuver around so I can see what I'm doing. The European politicians, from the moment that the financial crisis escalates, position themselves as outside this crisis. This is a problem of some other place. You have Per Steinbrück announcing that this is probably the makings of the end of American hegemony. And you have Giulio Tremonti, Berlusconi's finance ministry, excellent, announcing the Italian banking system will be great because it doesn't speak English. A year ago, in August 2017, quite gratuitously, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of what was, after all, the failure of 3 property funds managed by a French bank, the European Commission issued this press statement. 10 years ago, the global financial crisis broke out, triggering the worst recession in the 60-year history of the European Union. Although the crisis was not triggered in Europe, the EU institutions and member states have nevertheless to take decisive action to cushion the impact and to remedy the shortcomings of the original structure of the economic and monetary union. It is indeed a, shall we say, imaginative reconstruction of events 10 years ago to attribute them first and foremost to the United States and credit the European institutions with decisive action, prompt and decisive action to rescue Europe from this imported crisis. If you look inside the United States, you see a very different story. These are data compiled by the Bank of England as it tried to figure out what was going on. What it discovered was that in the crucial run-up to the crisis, in the segment of subprime securitization, which was the most dangerous component, the balance between American banks and outsiders dramatically shifted in the years immediately prior to the breakout of the crisis. The smart money is the pink money, the mauve money at the bottom. These are US security houses, Wall Street top players, who, as you can see, are limiting new commitments to this dangerous segment of the market. What comes on top of that, the purple segment, that's dumb American money. That's the big commercial banks, Citigroup, Bank of America, piling into a cooling market. But even dumber than them were the European banks, which pile in on a huge scale, securitizing about a third of the most toxic subprime in the run-up to the crisis. If you look at the ground level, the involvement of the European banks is, if anything, even more surprising. So if you take a place like Cleveland, post-industrial, Midwestern town, one of the ground zeros for the subprime disaster, these are the areas of Cleveland to which subprime loans and where they were concentrated in 2005. Now, this is an American story, so this is a story of race and racialized inequality. These are the African American, these are the black neighborhoods of Cleveland, and you can see the match. Subprime was a way in which disadvantaged ethnic minorities in the United States made their way onto the property ladder. Now you can see the fallout from that in 2007-8. Here are the foreclosures, the repossessions of property in Cleveland, the same fatal geography each time. Subprime, where black people live, and the houses that are foreclosed. And these are the properties that Deutsche Bank foreclosed on. So this is a lead European bank in the business here of administering the bottom end of the American mortgage market. These aren't even loans it made itself. This is a situation where Deutsche Bank is the trustee. Why would a bank like Deutsche Bank get involved in a business like this? Because if you're in the process of securitization, the entire game is to take low-quality, high-yielding loans into a chain through which they are then pooled, tranched and securitized, and the lower quality the material that you feed in at the bottom, the greater return on the difference that you achieve through the financial engineering. Deutsche Bank makes itself into an integral element of the most dangerous part of the American subprime story. And it's not as though this was really, truly even, a purely American story. Here, the story of debt and its escalation in the Eurozone before the crisis hit in 2008. And if you give this lecture to German audiences, not to invoke a stereotype, they will be convinced that you have mislabeled the two elements in the chart. Because as you can see here, public debt, sovereign debt, is not a problem in the Eurozone taken as a whole before 2008. And that is not news to people in Spain. What is a problem is the huge explosion of private debt. If America had a real estate bubble, Europe had a real estate bubble that was every bit as big, if not even bigger. So here the expansion of credit on the bottom axis and real estate housing prices on the vertical axis. And you can see the United States rather modestly in the middle of this graph, Spain and Ireland way out on the right-hand side. Proportionally, the Spanish and Irish housing bubbles were twice the size of the American bubble, to which the Eurozone and the European Commission attributes the main source of the crisis of 2008. This is neither an American nor simply a European Eurozone story. It's a story of unfettered banking around the world. As you can see, New Zealand participates in it, as well as the UK and Denmark, non-Eurozone European countries, as well as core members of the Eurozone. And as much as this is a transatlantic and a global bubble, it is also a global crunch. Again, the United States is the red dashed line in the middle of this graph. It does not stand out as a particularly shocking crisis. It does not stand out as a particularly shocking reversal. The far more extreme cases are Spain and Ireland. And it would be amazing if those countries had not suffered major real economic fallout from the bursting of this bubble in the same way as large parts of the United States were to do. And this is what sits behind this gross capital flows diagram with which we started a few minutes ago. It is the simultaneous implosion on both sides of the Atlantic of this giant credit bubble that is what's happening in 2008. Not an American or solely a European, but a transatlantic crisis. And in the shock to GDP that followed from the crisis, we see this exactly mapped. So here are the United States and Eurozone economies following a closely parallel path in the months either side of the financial crisis of 2008. But what I want to focus on in the rest of my lecture today is the divergence that follows, and think about the implications of that for our understanding of how the Eurozone functions and that question about the viability of the liberal order, which my host posed before my lecture. What we see here is the radical divergence between the Eurozone and the US economies in the wake of this crisis. How can we explain that? Why is it as dramatic as it is? How does the Eurozone crisis, which is being captured in this graph, relate to the crisis of 2008? Why was it so much harder to overcome what was basically a common shock in 2008 in the aftermath? Here, the same story measured not in terms of GDP, but in terms of unemployment. You see the closely parallel track of the impact of the crisis on both sides of the Atlantic, followed by the divergence, which is the difference in the lives of millions of people on either side of the Atlantic, and above all, of course, of young people who are the principal victims of this persistently high and rising unemployment in the Eurozone through to 2014. Why is the Eurozone different? Well, you might immediately be tempted to say, well, it was to do with the famous European austerity drive from 2010 onwards. And that is extremely real in its impact and its unbalanced impact. Whatever the case you might make for the need of the crisis-hit countries to contract their government budgets, and a case can be made, the question, of course, is why that was not offset by more substantial expansion in the more better-placed economies, and above all, Germany. What we see instead is a simultaneous contraction along the line of all of the government budgets in the Eurozone, with predictably damaging effects to aggregate demand. But the problem with this as an explanation for why the Eurozone diverges from the United States is that in 2010, everyone was convinced that they were Greece. It isn't just within the Eurozone that austerity rhetoric takes hold. At the G20 in Toronto, the decision makers took what is surely one of the most remarkable decisions ever collectively taken by a group of economic policymakers, given the situation, and their wording is telling. There's a risk that synchronized fiscal adjustment across several major economies could adversely impact the recovery. But there is also a risk that the failure to implement consolidation where necessary would undermine confidence and hamper growth. So you might think this was a question of weighing up two risks and splitting the difference. But the conclusion of the conference is dramatic. Reflecting this balance, advanced economies have committed to fiscal plans that will at least halve deficits by 2013 and stabilize or reduce government debt to GDP ratios by 2016. That's not splitting the difference. That's a wholehearted commitment to one of the most serious squeezes in fiscal policy terms ever attempted, let alone attempted in the course of a recovery. And this affects not just Spain and the Eurozone, but the United States as well. So the idea that America's divergence from Europe can be explained by the absence of austerity in the United States is fundamentally not supported by the facts. In fact, if you compare American economic recoveries from recessions since the Reagan era, the Reagan line being the blue one at the top here, and you look at the Obama recovery, what you see is a remarkable contraction of federal and local government spending in the United States at all levels over this period. In other words, there's austerity in the United States too. This cannot by itself be the main driver of an explanation. What we do need to explain is this difference. The fundamental difference in the American and European experience in the wake of 2008 is that the United States the government of the United States, gets a grip on the financial crisis there, stabilizes the banking system, and this enables, despite a relatively contractionary fiscal policy, a modest recovery in the United States. Nothing to celebrate or cheer about. It causes Larry Summers to speculate about secular stagnation, but it is at least not a disaster. What we see in the Eurozone instead is this extraordinary pattern, in which the risk attributed to government debt, as measured by the credit default swap, which is insurance against default, moves in a strongly correlated way with the risk associated with the default on banks. In other words, the banks and the sovereign are pulling each other down in the so-called doom loop. This is the fundamental difference between the aftermath of the crisis in the United States and in Europe. So how do we explain this? Well, one basic answer is to go back to how we view the balance of finance, politics, and economics before the crisis on either side of the Atlantic. Buried in the European assumption that the financial crisis was basically made in America is the idea that Europe is not as much a center of financialization and financial speculation as the United States. But measured relative to the resources of the national economies which host the banks, The obverse, the reverse, is clearly the case. What you see here is the extraordinary difference between the size, say, of a big American bank like JP Morgan or Citigroup, monstrous banks by any measure, and the United States economy, in relation to which their balance sheets are maybe 15 or 13% of the United States economy, and the situation of a respectable European country like Switzerland, which has two banks whose balance sheets are multiples of Swiss GDP. In other words, Switzerland is in a far more precarious position than the United States when faced with the crisis of 2008. This is one of the fundamental drivers of that doom loop interconnection between states and banks in Europe in the aftermath of the crisis. The banks were too big for the sovereigns that were supporting them. By contrast, America implements, in the wake of the crisis, and certainly in the aftermath of Lehman, about which we could talk more in Q&A, a full spectrum response to the crisis. And it's able to do so from the relatively solid platform of the American state, drawing on the tax base of a much larger economy. It provides immediate support for the banking system in the form of recapitalization and guarantees. Crucially, it recapitalizes all its banks. It supports asset markets by way of QE, which remains controversial in the Eurozone until 2015. And it provides an aggressive expansionary fiscal stimulus in the stimulus the Obama administration passes in early 2009. The critical moment, I think, in the view of most analysts of the European and American crisis, the critical turning point is the 13th of October, Monday the 13th of October. This was the Monday on which all of the governments around the world rolled out their packages of guarantees to the global banks. And on the afternoon of 13th of October in the Treasury in Washington, a very dramatic meeting happened between Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, Ben Bernanke, the Fed Chair, Geithner, then the New York Fed Chair, and Sheila Bair, who runs the FDIC, the fund which insures smaller American banks. It was a spectacular meeting because the 9 leading CEOs of America's biggest banks had been summoned to the meeting, and it was an offer that they were told they could not and should not refuse. They were expected to be there, but they didn't know why. And it turned out that what they were going to be confronted with the officials on the other side of the table literally shoving a piece of paper to each one of the CEOs, what they were going to be required to do was to take compulsory recapitalization funds from the American state to stabilize their banks. And what the officials on the other side of the table made clear is that everyone was going to have to accept this money. JP Morgan and Wells Fargo, the two strongest American banks, had little economic incentive to take the money at the time, but the idea was that if everyone took it, there'd be no stigma. It would create confidence in the American banking system and relaunch American finance. And if the banks hated the government money, then they'd be all the quicker to raise private funds to replace it the following year. When Wells Fargo said, well, we really think this is a New York problem, we live in California, we have nothing to do with your banking crisis on the East Coast, the officials opposite pointed out to them that if they were to walk away from the meeting, they would be visited by their regulators the following day. The regulators would conclude that they were undercapitalized. They would inform the markets that they were undercapitalized, and the day after that, they would be back in Washington asking for the same money, and this time it would be more expensive. Another key element of the deal was that the money wasn't expensive. To bring the strongest banks into the deal alongside the weakest, the terms had to be extraordinarily good. So one of Paulson's collaborators said, this was not a mafia deal, this is not Godfather, this is not an offer that you can't refuse, this is an offer you would be foolish, idiotic indeed, not to take up. But the consequence of that is dramatic, because what it does is to restabilize the American banking system and to set the terms for the rapid recapitalization in 2009. So why was the American state able to do this? Part of the answer is that in relation to the resources of the US Treasury, even the biggest banks are small. But there's more to the answer than that. It wasn't simple to do. After all, the Americans did screw up the Lehman situation. They couldn't figure out a way of saving Lehman without government resources. What's happening on the October 13th is a drama for the Americans as well. To have moved from failing to bail Lehman to nationalizing all their banks is a dramatic step even for them to take. But an absolutely key element of the deal is elite closure. What happens at that meeting is, after all, extremely peculiar. Because on the one hand, you have Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, the descendant of Alexander Hamilton, in all his pomp and power, saying to the banks, you must take this money. And on the other hand, who is Hank Paulson? 2 years earlier, he was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. So another way of reading the meeting is that two groups of Wall Street bankers got together in a room that was provided by the US government and decided amongst themselves exactly how much money from the American taxpayer was going to go into this pot. Underpinning this is a network of interconnection between money and power in the United States, which you can't represent, as I have here, without looking like a conspiracy theorist. There is no obvious way of representing this network without beginning to look as though you belong to the crazy fringe of social and political criticism. But this is literally the network mobilized around Robert Rubin, the decisive figure in this network created in the 1990s around the Clinton administration. He himself, a former head of Goldman Sachs. The entire team of the Obama administration's economics department was recruited from this network. The figures on the right, Brad Setzer, now a leading blogger at the CFR, and that's Brad DeLong, a leading blogger out of Berkeley, all connected to this. That's Nouriel Roubini on the left-hand side there. And this is the famous encounter between Robert Rubin and Hank Paulson when they reminisced about doing God's work at Goldman Sachs and couldn't contain their mirth at the idea that this is what they shared in common. This cuts across party lines, it cuts across administrations, it constitutes an extraordinary nexus, the force of which you really have to be on the inside of an American Ivy League university to appreciate quite how dense it is. Being a veteran, as my host said, both of Cambridge and of Yale and Columbia, I can tell you how much denser the American network is. It's an extraordinary thing to witness. They're not just a close-knit elite, they're also a political and economic elite with a sense of mission. One thing it's very important to understand about the United States in 2008 is that it's a state at war. It's been at war since 9/11. We tend to dismiss this as Europeans, as sort of American melodrama. It's in fact constitutive of the identity of American policymakers at the moment, and they are quite forthcoming about it. Here, an extraordinarily telling scene in which you have key figures of this network in the same image. Of course, Madeleine Albright, the great inspiration of Democratic Party policymaking, Colin Powell, the Chief of Staff, America's leading Clausewitzian, and behind the two of them, the young, fresh-faced Tim Geithner on his way by way of the New York Fed to the Obama administration. And this isn't just a matter of another set of personal networks. This is the idea, a shared set of values and ideas on the part of these American decision makers that makes them fundamentally different in their self-understanding to their European counterparts. Because what Tim Geithner thinks of himself as doing after 2009 is inheriting the mantle of people like Larry Summers in the 1990s, and what they thought of themselves as doing is implementing what Summers called the Powell Doctrine of financial crisis management. And the Powell Doctrine of financial crisis management is the application to finance of the lessons learned by the American military in the quagmire of Vietnam. What these American policymakers are doing is thinking about how you deploy force in a way that actually gives you historical agency. And you don't get there simply through following the rules. You get there by thinking operationally about the kind of crisis you face. They're not constrained in the same way as many conservatives, what we might think of as many European neoliberals are, by the sense of rule as the central idea. They have an extraordinarily explicit idea of agency, of the need for action in situations of emergency. And this is reflected not just in what the Americans do domestically, but in the way in which they position the United States as a global actor in the crisis. There are two elements of this that I really want to emphasize to you and that I emphasize in the book, are the willingness of the Fed to act as a global lender of last resort in the crisis is quite extraordinary. Faced with the implosion of the transatlantic banking system, faced with a crippling shortage of dollars, what the Fed does is to step into the breach. This is a table revealed by a suit brought by the Bloomberg News organization and fought all the way up to the Supreme Court, which for the first time reveals in real time, if you like, or close to real time, the anatomy of a lender of last resort operation. This is when a central bank takes illiquid assets off the books of banks and gives them cash in exchange. It's the way you stop a bank run. And normally, of course, central banks are extremely shy about revealing this kind of data for fear of stigma. If banks are exposed as needing liquidity, they won't take the liquidity they need. So this is why they fought the case to the Supreme Court. It's not just secretiveness, it's actually a desire to protect the mechanism. For a historian, however, it's a treasure trove, because what we can see is the scale, not just of the liquidity provided to the American banks, but to the European banks too. If you look down the list here, you see all of the European suspects, and they're taking about $500 billion each in liquidity, which in relation to their balance sheets of, say, $2 trillion, is a quarter of their balance sheet. Somewhere between a quarter and a third was made liquid by the Fed so that they could meet obligations in dollars. And when that wasn't enough, the Fed resorted to a more roundabout mechanism of providing liquidity to the transatlantic banking system. What it effectively did was to repurpose the central banks of Europe as dollar cash machines. So what it did was to provide them with so-called liquidity swap lines, which allows a central bank to call down as many dollars as its local banks are needing in exchange for agreed sums of the currency that it can print. So in the case of the ECB credits the Fed with a certain quantity of euro, in exchange for which the Fed, with an agreement like this, that I always joke with my students resembles a standard rental agreement, but in this case, it's tens and then hundreds of billions of dollars which are changing hands. And the Fed will agree to provide the ECB with quantums of dollars to offset and to match the euros which the ECB is crediting the Fed with. The scale of this is gigantic. By the end of 2008, as the dollar credit squeeze is impacting the European banks, as that flow of finance across borders is collapsing to extraordinarily low levels, the Fed steps in and provides the liquidity for the global banking system. And as Ben Bernanke coyly admits at the end of 2008, shyly says in his memoirs, it was the largest single item on our balance sheet. As a European central banker described it, the flows of money which you see aggregated here, which for the ECB amount to $2.5 trillion worth of liquidity provided to it by the Fed over the period of the crisis, it was as though the European central banks had been turned into the 13th branch of the Fed. Now, the people doing this were aware that this was a shocking transformation of the Fed's role. Lender of last resort is a standard central banking function. Being lender of last resort to all the world's banks by means of transfers on this kind of scale is no one's idea of a standard central banking role. But they do it quite explicitly driven by the sense that the United States is the anchor of a global banking system, that the results for the United States will be catastrophic if they don't act, and they're the only people who can provide the dollars. It's part of a concerted package. We know this from the FOMC minutes, pushed by Tim Geithner, the other element of which, if you're not lucky enough to be included in this magic circle of central banks that get swap lines, if you're not in the Swiss, Scandinavian, European, Japanese, South Korean kind of nexus, if you're not in that category, then you need to go to the IMF. So the IMF, at the beginning of the crisis, is a small, reduced institution that since the late 1990s has suffered a major legitimacy crisis. The critiques of globalization in the late 1990s struck home. They were painfully effective in delegitimizing the IMF. In 2007, when Dominic Strauss-Kahn takes over, his main job is to fire staff, because the IMF at that point has two clients, Pakistan and Turkey. It doesn't look as though it's going to be a major institution of the 21st century, because no self-respecting emerging market economy after the experience of the late 90s will ever borrow from the IMF again. This is not how the folks in Washington see the institution that is headquartered in Washington and is in which America has a commanding vote. They see the IMF as the last line of crisis fighting if all else fails. If the banks can't be provided with money in Wall Street, if the central bank swap lines don't work, the IMF will step in. And this is what the IMF does on a huge scale from the fall of 2008. We far too easily, in our obsession with Western Europe and America, ignore the ripple effects of the crisis out across Eastern Europe, and those are the casualties that the IMF is catching. And to do that, it needs new resources. It needs to move from being a mid-20th century institution with the resources of the 1940s. It needs to move to being an institution capable of dealing with a massive global financial crisis, the order of magnitude for which is trillions. And so in the spring of 2009 at the second G20 meeting, a key American agenda item is to expand the IMF resource base to in excess of $1 trillion so as to be able to sustain this process of catching the crisis cases in the global economy. Irony of ironies, of course, is that the chief beneficiary of this expansion of IMF resources are the Eurozone crisis fighters in 2010, because the IMF provides a key element in the backstop to the first Greek deal in May 2010. And that's what I want to turn on to now. If this is the kind of energy, if this is the kind of idea self-identity, if this is the sort of social network which is driving the American crisis fighting in 2008-9, it gives us, I think, a new way of understanding the deficits on the European side. It also gives us a way of understanding why the UK and Switzerland, small countries with massive banks, managed to survive the crisis in the way that they do. They are plugged directly into the American support system. They are similarly small, compact, and capable of organizing a sustained political response to the crisis. Political sociology, elite self-conceptions matter if we're going to understand these differences. What we're going to get in the Eurozone is this kind of dispersion in which the sovereign and the banks pull each other down. Now, there are those who say, particularly coming from the left, that there is a simple logic to the Eurozone management of the crisis. And the simple logic is what my colleague Mark Blythe, in a really telling phrase, has summarized as bait and switch. In other words, pretend it's one thing and then shift other things around as you're doing it, like a conjurer or a street magician who's trying to rob you of your euros. And the deal that Mark thinks is really driving this is that the European governments understand that the crisis of 2008 is a banking crisis and turn it by political sleight of hand, by, if you like, the workings of political ideology and magic, into a sovereign debt crisis, which it was in Greece, but nowhere else in the Eurozone. And so this is an extraordinarily effective repositioning of the politics of the crisis, in which the European banks are shielded at the expense of the taxpayers of the Eurozone. Now, this is a good political argument, in my view, because it focuses attention where attention needs to be focused. In other words, on the banks, which are, in fact, the weak link in the Eurozone crisis. And in Spain and Ireland are clearly driving the crisis all along. Sovereign debt should never have been made into the central issue of the crisis. So, as a kind of braking iron, as a wedge to drive into the conventional narrative of the Eurozone crisis, the idea of bait and switch will do. But is it plausible as a rationalization for what actually happens in the Eurozone? One's tempted to say that if the Eurozone crisis fighter were friends of the European banks, one is terrified to think what enemies of the European banks would have looked like. Because the outcome of Eurozone crisis fighting is, after all, a heavy blow to the financial competitiveness of the European banking system. It has neither a platform for domestic profit nor a forced government recapitalization. It limps along in its current state, outcompeted by the Americans and the Asians. If the left are right in claiming that the Eurozone is intended fundamentally as a platform for capital accumulation by European business, you have to say that between 2008 and 2014, it was a disaster. This does not look like a successful strategy of shuffling the problems of Europe's banks off stage. On the contrary, what it seems to suggest is that, in fact, the problems of Europe's banks and its sovereigns became massively entangled and self-reinforcing. It didn't reduce the pressure on Europe's banks, it increased it, as we know from the Italian case, as in fact we know from the Greek case too, where the crisis in the government debt market creates enormous problems for the banks. And the next question I'm forced to ask, and this is where I will come to the end of my observations and we can open up for discussion, is if this is not a good functionalist explanation because it simply doesn't ring true and Europe's banks have not benefited from the way in which the crisis was handled, is it a good historical account of what was going on in the Eurozone in this period? And I want to use one slightly polemical, but I think nevertheless sort of effective slide to illustrate this point. Let's take what in many ways was the beginning of the Eurozone crisis in May 2010 and ask ourselves, who are the actors involved in this crisis at that moment? And have in mind always that compact, tightly networked, energized elite in the United States as a point of contrast. Well, of course, there were the banks in the Greek crisis, but there was also France, the French government, which was as close as anyone came to pursuing a policy on the Eurozone driven by its banks. But of course, you have Germany and Merkel's second coalition government. And you have the rest of the EU to deal with. And you have the ECB as a key voice in the entire debate, which at all costs wants to avoid a debt write-down. And behind Merkel's second coalition government, and this matters because Germany is the most powerful actor in the system, you have the SPD opposition, which is the alternate government in waiting. And you have the German Constitutional Court, which has strong views about the Lisbon Treaty and what Brussels should be allowed and what it shouldn't be allowed to do. And you have the German Central Bank, which will vigorously resist any efforts by the ECB to do bond buying. And then you have the Obama administration, which also cares about the Greek crisis. Why? Not because it cares about Greece, but because American money market mutual funds have roughly $1 trillion invested in a European dollar debt, and they don't want, in their words, Greece to turn into another Lehman. And that, of course, means that the IMF is involved because the Obama administration has the controlling vote on the IMF. And on the IMF board, however, you also have to listen to the Swiss, the Argentinians, the Brazilians, and the Chinese. And then, finally, last but not least, you have the markets driving this entire process with the relentless pressure of markets acting in horrified disbelief at this extraordinarily incoherent decision-making picture that we have here. It is true that the crisis in the Eurozone gets translated from a crisis of banks into a crisis of sovereign debt. But my suggestion to you is that that happens not as the result of a concerted strategy, if you like, of substitution, but as a result, essentially, of a lowest common denominator compromise. Compare and contrast the extraordinary complexity of the image I've just shown you with Europe with this image of Washington in the crucial days in September 2008, and you have all the important people on one single photograph. You have Ben Bernanke, you have Hank Paulson, and crucially, you have the leaders of the Democratic Party in Congress, Nancy Pelosi, at the forefront, at the microphone there. To my mind, the result of austerity, the focus on supply-side reform in labour markets, the relentless focus on these elements of Eurozone crisis fighting, are not the realization of some scheme to take the banks out of harm's way, or the perfect realization of some German agenda for the Eurozone. Ask any German conservative, and they'll tell you how incompletely their dreams have been realized. It's the only thing that this entire mess of actors can agree on from May 2010 onwards. In the absence of being able to broker the extraordinarily complex deal on debt restructuring, bank recapitalization, and central bank support that the crisis really demands, and that the Eurozone agonizingly works its way towards in 2012, in the absence of being able to do that grand deal, you end up with this lowest common denominator outcome. This is in no way to minimize the damage that it does. It's simply to be clear about what the process of political decision-making was that led to this outcome, which is so disastrously suboptimal for all of Europe. And of course, the problem is, and now I really come to the end, the way in which that inadequate sticking plaster, what Yanis Varoufakis so aptly calls the policy of extend and pretend, just go on running the Greek crisis, pretending that it's going to be okay, and then tell them to do austerity and do supply-side reform because we can't agree on anything else. The consequence of that was, in fact, not to contain the crisis, but to spread it outwards from Greece, which in the face of it is really a trivial actor in its own right, to entities which aren't. Principally, of course, Spain and Italy. Spain, as I always explain to my American interlocutors, an entity the size of Texas, and please forgive the comparison, it conveys to Americans how important Spain is when you compare it to Texas. And even bigger than that, a piece which, again, you communicate to Americans by saying it's the size of California, Italy, which is the hub of all Eurozone fear in the fall of 2011. We know now what is necessary to break this loop. Fiscal discipline, banking union, ECB bond purchases, and I'll leave you with this somewhat grim conclusion. We know what is necessary to stabilize this system. It is essentially what the Americans did in 2008. We have had 10 agonizing years of experience with the inadequacy of these elements in the Eurozone, and this autumn and this winter we face a repeat of precisely the scenario that I've been outlining to you, already visible and being watched day by day on market screens around the world. You can hear the rumble of speculators around the world asking themselves whether these graphs here, which map the credit default swap correlation between the Italian sovereign and Italy's two leading banks, whether these herald the return of a doom loop scenario. Friends of mine have warned me that the problem with writing a book like this is that you may never be able to get off the treadmill. But I will conclude by saying that I sincerely hope that a new edition of the book is not necessary by the summer of next year, because that would really point, I think, to the sense in which this is still an ongoing crisis, which at its heart Europe has failed to resolve all the way down to the present day. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to answering your questions.